Hi, today on Business Talk, we are going to take a deep look on environmental, social and governance, or ESG, and we'll take a look on the importance of women on pushing ESG. Women entrepreneurs are not just chasing their dreams, but they're important contributors to the country's economy. Women play a pivotal role in this landscape, accounting for more than 64.5% of MSME ownership or management. This dominance presents an exciting opportunity. Investing in women entrepreneurship in Indonesia is not just about social good, but also a strategic economic imperative. Indonesia boasts over 64 million MSMEs, making up a staggering 98% of all businesses in the country. These micro, small and medium enterprises are projected to contribute a whopping 61% to Indonesia's $1.54 trillion economy by 2024. Impressively, more than half of these MSMEs are women-owned. This translates to a significant opportunity. Women-led businesses in Indonesia represent a potential market worth at least $470 billion. A 2023 World Bank study underscores this potential. It estimates that if women-owned businesses in Indonesia achieved revenue parity with male counterparts, the country's economy could generate an additional $428 million annually. Now, despite their significant presence, Indonesian women entrepreneurs face unique challenges when assessing funding. Traditionally, financial institutions often perceive women as high-risk borrowers due to factors such as limited business collateral or lack of formal economic history. And today, we dive into the transformative role of venture capital in advancing environmental, social and governance goals, also in empowering women-led businesses. We'll explore how venture capital investment can drive positive change, promote gender equality and spur economic growth through support for women entrepreneurs. So let's uncover the profound impact of venture capital in shaping a more inclusive and sustainable future with Head of Platform and Venture Partner at Moonshot Ventures, Massimiliano Hasan. Hi, Max. Thank you for stopping by at See Today Business.
Thanks for having me, and impeccable pronunciation with my name, by the way. Not everybody can get it right, but please call me Max for short.
All right. So, Max, how did you get involved with this venture and in Southeast Asia, and particularly in ESG and the women-led business?
Well, my story goes pretty far back. I grew up between Indonesia and the U.S., so from a young age, I became acutely aware of the economic differences between the U.S., a developed market, and Indonesia, a developing market. And about 12 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I was reading this book called Poor Economics, written by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, the Nobel laureates from a couple years ago in economics. And they were talking a lot about the role of microfinance in solving poverty. And I was really inspired by that book, and I actually took up an internship back in Jakarta working in microfinance, specifically housing microfinance. And one of the key insights that I got from that experience was that actually, almost exactly the opposite of what you said earlier. A lot of the borrowers, they perceive women as higher risk. What we actually found was women are actually better at repaying loans than their male counterparts.
Really?
Yeah, and from that experience, I immediately, it struck a chord with me, and I wanted to operate at the intersection of impact, but also at commercial, right? So profit and purpose, that's where I saw sort of my path getting towards the impact investing world, the ESG world, et cetera.
So what are some of the major micro trends in respect to funding ventures across Southeast Asia? We know that this region, Asia in particular, is one of the biggest emitters in the world.
Yeah.
And it's developing. And we're trying hard to actually implement the ESG.
Yeah. So I think a little bit of a history lesson. So if you look at the term ESG, that term has been around for about now 20 years or so. The UN coined the term in 2005, 2004, around that.
Almost as old as you, I know.
Oh, I wish. And basically, that term was used to sort of encapsulate this ethos around investing with good intentions in mind, right? Environmental, social, and governance.
Yeah.
Then flash forward 10 years after that, 2015 or thereof, where the SDGs were introduced also by the UN. The SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, which added a little bit more clarity around what the impact themes would look like, right? So things like clean energy, things like empowering women, things like making sure there's access to clean water, exactly like you mentioned. So, you know, that that history is an interesting parallel to comparing that to the Southeast Asia tech scene, which I think you could say it started about 15 years ago, right? The likes of like Grab, Gojek, Tokopedia, Bukalapak, Traveloka, they all started around 2010. And now most of those startups that I just mentioned, they're like publicly traded companies, right? So you could almost say that that sort of tech wave started off and, you know, crested and fell in the past 15 years.
Okay.
Now we're entering an interesting period because if you look at the VC funds balance sheets, the amount of capital that's basically committed, they call it dry powder in VC parlance. That's at an all-time high in Southeast Asia. It's about $16 billion or thereof. But then if you actually look at funding trends, that funding is actually not materializing. And the reason for that, I think, is because, well, like I mentioned before, the wave of Southeast Asia tech, you know, has sort of risen from 2010 and sort of stabilized and led to a few IPOs. But then in the past couple of years, in the high interest rate environment, it's also led to a lot of sort of easy money running out.
Wow.
And it's led to a lot of high-profile failures. You know, the likes of Zenius, Tani Hub, Investry, Octopus, right? People you've probably mentioned in headlines before. So now VCs are kind of cautious. They're like, we've got all this dry powder in our funds. We don't really want to deploy capital. So we're pausing and reassessing what our investment thesis looks like. And a lot of these VCs are now starting to take on these lens of like impact, ESG, sustainability, gender lens. And one thing that you can see, there was a chart before that was being shown, showing the trend of climate tech in particular. So climate tech startups are basically any startup that's tackling either climate mitigation, which is reducing the amount of carbon that's being emitted or taking back in the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere, or climate adaptation, which is basically adapting and making populations more resilient to the effects of climate change. That particular sector within VC is actually increasing over time. In 2018, it was about $50 million or so in total VC funding going towards climate tech in Southeast Asia. Now it's hit about 1 billion. So it's a 20x increase over the past 6 years or so.
Right. I mean, it's pretty sad when you said there is a funding gap.
Yeah.
So how okay, for you as a venture as well, so how do you make sure that these funding come into companies that really implement the ESG implementation so that it makes a good trends as well in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. So just to sort of give a little bit more context in how big the gap is, just so we understand the magnitudes here. If we talk about climate finance, there's about $1.3, $1.4 trillion of climate finance annually that's being spent on climate mitigation and adaptation solutions. The total annual need is actually more like 8.6 to 9 trillion, sorry. So we're talking in the trillions here, 1,000 billion. For context, for reference, the Indonesian GDP last year was about 1.3 trillion, right? So Indonesian GDP is equivalent to the amount of climate funding that's occurring right now. And yet, there's still a massive gap between that $1.3 trillion figure that's actually materializing and the amount that's needed, which is like 8.6 trillion, right? It's like a 6x gap. If we look at gender, there's a massive gap there too. It's about $2 trillion per year. And then if we look at the SDG financing gap, that's, I think, somewhere in the order of, let me just check my notes so I don't get it wrong. That is $4 trillion. So we're in the trillions here. We're talking with a T, not a B. So it's a pretty big funding gap. In particular, I think one of the biggest needs is if we look at just the global trends of how the temperature has been changing. You know, I think maybe 10, 20 years ago, we were very optimistic in trying to achieve that 1 Celsius or so above pre-industrial warming levels. Now we're about 1.1 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And at current trends, probably going towards that 1.5 to 2 Celsius.
True.
And so the need for climate adaptation in particular, that one's a really big gap that's really needed and fast. So that's actually the area that Moonshot plays in, is climate adaptation plus gender lens.
Okay, can you tell how many have you done it in Indonesia, for example, or in other parts of Southeast Asia?
So to give a bit of background about Moonshot Ventures, previously Moonshot Ventures was managing a fund called the Indonesian Women Empowerment Fund. And as the name would suggest, that was investing in Indonesian female entrepreneurs, sector agnostic. So it could be health tech, ed tech, etc. That fund made about 16 investments and was also running an accelerator program in parallel to that called She Disrupts. So the idea was, okay, She Disrupts would run in parallel to Moonshot's Indonesian Women Empowerment Fund, and then the graduates from that accelerator would then get investment from IWEF, Indonesian Women Empowerment Fund. So that was the first fund. Now we're sort of relaunching a second fund, which is called the Impact Debt Fund. And that one is specifically focused on, yes, the gender lens, so female founders, but also climate adaptation, as I mentioned before.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, can you discuss the existing initiatives that are aiming to tackle this problem, especially in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so aside from Moonshot Ventures, I want to shout out a couple of other of our peers in the space that are doing great work from different angles. So one venture capital fund in particular that's based in Singapore, they're called SIF. They're also focused on early stage climate tech as well. Great guys, Rowan Patak, David Pardo, some of my friends. There's another outfit that's based in Singapore called Wavemaker Impact, and their approach is actually even going earlier stage. So what they do is they're a venture builder, and what they do is they find successful entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, we've seen about 15 years of Southeast Asia tech, and out of that Southeast Asia tech 15-year history, we've seen some successful exits and some founders who've created really great businesses. Now, some of those founders are being retrained by Wavemaker Impact to become climate founders. So maybe somebody created some e-commerce platform before and exited it. Now they're retraining to set up solar panels in Philippines, right? And we're seeing these trends play out in different ways with different players across the space. And it's really exciting to see how people's innovation comes up with different approaches, but ultimately solving the same problem.
Okay, I want to have a close look on maybe an example, if you could give a specific case of how Moonshot Ventures impact debt programs.
Sure. So I can give a real-life example from actually a venture that's based here in Indonesia, well, technically in Bali, not too far away from here, just an hour flight. So Terra Water, they're called. They're focused on clean water, as the name would suggest. And Christine Manson, she was actually on this show about 2 years ago.
Oh.
I think it was like in the middle of pandemic or something, so she was zooming in. And
Nice.
it's great to see that you've actually pulled up that clip there.
Yeah.
So Terra Water is great. We really like
There
them.
it is.
They, if you look at the ESG, they tick off the E and the S very clearly. So they manufacture these water filters using natural materials, clay from Tabanan in Bali. And then with that clay, they layer on activated carbon and silver colloid. And that is enough to actually filter your water from the tap to be potable, right? So it reduces the need to get an aqua gallon or to buy plastic water bottles that are very wasteful, right?
Yeah.
And it's run by an amazing female founder, Christine. And she has a solid team under her, about 10 people, all based in Bali. And we're actually helping her now to figure out how she can scale beyond Bali. So obviously Bali, it's what, 3-4 million people. Maybe if you add the tourists, it's 6 million people. But compared to Bali, I mean, compared to Jakarta, that's like what? That's maybe Jaksel, right?
Just
so
Jaksel.
She clearly needs to expand the business beyond Bali, across Southeast Asia. So Moonshot's coming in. We're helping her with some technical assistance to get her to an investment readiness stage where she's ready to scale and go to market and also take on additional capital as a more mature business.
That's a very nice choosing. I mean, with using clay, as you mentioned, it's not only that it's very friendly to the environment, it's also very cool, and you've filtrated the water, so that's it in one go.
And it's from Indonesia.
It's from Indonesia, local wisdom. Exactly. Massimiliano Hasan, thank you so much for sharing with us in Business Talk. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure for us too. All right, so that's Business Talk. You can stay connected with us on our social media. We are available on Instagram, X, and YouTube with handle @CTodayNews.